So I think Marc needs no introduction, but I will do a short introduction for the folks who don't know. Marc first actually entered the scene as the co-creator of the first internet browser and co-founded Netscape, which later sold for $4.2 billion to a company called AOL, which used to be a big dominant company at the time. And then he also you can go ahead.
No, it was a specifically big dominant company here in the Virginia, DC complex. So
exactly.
Everybody here knows it well.
And you co-founded LoudCloud, which sold to HP for $1.6 billion, where you ultimately were on the board. Most recently being 2009, you co-founded Andreessen Horowitz, and a venture fund now that manages over $30 billion in capital. And he's been a long-term board member at Meta and also Applied Intuition. So let's welcome Marc. So we have some time here. We want to really dive into three specific sections of the conversation today. First, American dynamism. It's a concept that your firm has created, and we want to talk a little bit about that. Number two, Silicon Valley and the government. You guys have been investing, and you're quite close to the DC ecosystem as well. And then third, outside of all this, the markets today and what's happening. The markets have been quite volatile, so we want to get your thoughts on those as well. So first and foremost, what is the American dynamism thesis, just so everyone's on the same page?
Yeah, so the idea of American dynamism, it's a whole investment program effort we have, and it cuts heavily into national. A big part of it is national security, defense, intelligence, and helping to build companies that directly address the defense and intelligence community. The basic thesis is very straightforward, which is just, let's get emotional. This used to be a country that built things, right? Like this used to be a country that built big, dramatic things, right? Giant dams, the Hoover Dam and the Golden Gate Bridge and the Apollo Project and the Manhattan Project and so forth. And by the way, we built cities, right? It's just like, I was just reminded, driving into DC from the airport today, it's just like, all these just like giant buildings that have been there for, I don't know how long, 150, 200 years, and will be there for another, probably 1,000 years. This city was a startup at one point, right? Where I am, San Francisco was a startup at one point. All American cities were startups at one point. The whole country was a startup, not that long ago. And it's a country that always prided itself on production. And this almost sounds heretical. I'm just going to say something out loud that just sounds like almost like sacrilegious these days. Production as a social good. Like we are going to build things and make things, and we are going to consume raw materials, and we are going to use energy, and we are going to have factories and plants, and we are going to produce things. And those things are going to make the country better and going to make the world better. And it's like in sort of like the immediate reaction that you kind of have to that, even if you're kind of maybe a little bit more politically on the right, it's like, ooh, like, is that environmentally friendly, right? Like you just get this like immediate like, I don't know if we're supposed to be doing that kind of thing anymore, right? And sure enough, it's like what do you see in the U.S.? No more cities, right? When was the last time a new city was created in the U.S.? It was actually I think it was all the way back in the 1950s. When's the last time we built a supersonic air transport, right? Yep. It's like, well, we've actually been climbing down from supersonic air travel, right? We decided that apparently that's it's too fast, and so we basically have decided. And I think basically what happened was we decided sort of starting in the 1960s, we decided as a society and as a culture, let's just say to deprioritize building and deprioritize production and maybe start to, Do you
think that was conscious or why did that happen?
So I think there's a couple of things. So I think there was a cultural political change that happened, and I'll probably avoid there's a big political discussion you could have on this because there was, a big kind of political social revolution in the 60s that I think was the origin of a lot of this, but I'll try to sidestep that because I want to, this is a big tent audience. I don't want to alienate anybody. But I think also there's like a systems design kind of aspect to it, right? Which is basically we decided societally and culturally that we were going to implement what some people refer to as a vetocracy, which is basically a system in which a lot of people get a veto, right? And so if you think this comes up all the time in the both parties propose these infrastructure bills, right? Every time somebody gets in the White House, they propose an infrastructure bill, and it's like wow, we're going to have funding to build all these new dams and factories and chip fabs and all these amazing things, and it's like it's illegal to build all those things, right? Like try to build a new dam or a new toll road or try to build a housing complex in San Francisco, right? Like it's basically like completely illegal. San Francisco this year has authorized 70 new housing units for the entire city, right? 70, right? The estimates are that the Bay Area is missing up to 2 million housing units, right, as compared to the number of people who actually economically want to live in the Bay Area, and so San Francisco's going to build 70. And so we've created basically a set of systems in which a lot of people have the ability to basically say, no, that's not going to happen. Another example is, try to build a new hospital, right? And it turns out there's a process for building new hospitals. Hospitals have to get accredited. They have to get accredited by the Association of whatever hospital accreditation, that's got some big acronym that I'm sure has some big office downtown here. Guess who runs the hospital accreditation, committee, right, is the existing hospitals. Right. Guess how excited they are at authorizing the construction of a new hospital right down the street that's going to compete with them. And so you just have example after example after example, right, of how basically decisions can be stopped. Obviously in Washington this plays out very visibly obviously in Congress, with oversight, right? Who could argue with oversight? Well, oversight is a wonderful process for preventing things from happening, right? From new programs getting funded or new approaches being taken. And so we've decided culturally, societally, that we just basically don't want the kind of forward motion we used to have happen. So for me, what happened was what led us to this investment program was, for me, I had a particular moment where I kind of snapped, and I couldn't. I had my I remember the movie Network, my Howard Beale moment where I screamed out the window, I can't take it anymore. It was at the height of COVID. It was the height of the first big wave of COVID in America. And remember, COVID in the U.S. hit New York City particularly hard, right? In the summer of 2020, really hard. There was a lot of suffering, and so there was this huge crisis at the time. There was a shortage of all this stuff, and at the time, people were very worried about the shortage of ventilators, which turned out to be less of an issue. But they were worried about the shortage of so-called personal protective equipment, right? And it's okay, and there was big concern. People were hoarding masks, and remember, civilians were not supposed to wear masks, right, up until wearing masks became absolutely mandatory, right? When the experts did a 180. But there was all this concern about whether people working in hospitals, doctors and nurses would be able to have masks, whether they'd have surgical gloves. And then there was this call. The mayor of the city at the time put out a call, and he said, "We're out of surgical gowns. Would people in New York City please bring your trash bags and rain ponchos and drop them off at your nearest hospital for use as surgical gowns in the ORs and in the intensive care units?" And that was my moment where I'm just okay, we need to be able to make surgical gowns. Yeah. We need to be able to make masks. We need to be able to make gloves. We need to be able to make ventilators. Right, which again at the time we thought we need. We need to be able to make. By the way, we need to be able to make vaccines. It actually turned out we had the ability to make vaccines, right? So that was a huge kind of bright spot. But there was just this moment where it's okay, what has happened to us? And then of course the strategic backdrop behind that, which was really kicking in right around that time, was okay, to what extent is a very broad range of goods and services produced in America very dependent on parts and components and inputs, right, from overseas? And so there was big concern right at that moment that the supply chain, the drug supply chain, which is heavily based in India, was going to break down. And then of course there's all the geopolitical issues involving the supply chain coming in from China. And in fact, here we sit today, and a lot of car companies, including American car companies, can't actually make cars today because they can't get the parts from China, right? So then there's this whole reshoring thing that's finally starting to happen. But it's okay, how did we get in this position? Why don't we have production capacity for all the things that we need? And it's because we chose to stop making things. And so basically, I think it's time to re-examine that.
And roughly, how do we find our way out of that hole?
Yeah, so the first thing I did, so I wrote an essay called "It's Time to Build" at the time, and basically what I said was, look, a big part of it's a very complex. It took 50 years to get in this situation. It's going to take a long time to get out, and there are no easy answers. But the first thing for sure is to kind of decide on what the goals are, right? And which is why I kind of start this the way that I do, which is is the goal to build things, right? Is the goal to build new things? Is the goal to build new factories? Is the goal to build new infrastructure, new products, whatever it is the goal to build it. And then we in our system have, lots of different points of view. People have lots of different points of view. And again, this gets into politics very fast because people on the left have, a lot of strong points of view about what the government should be doing versus what businesses should be doing. People on the right are very, proud of what businesses do. My critique of people on the right with this is there's a distinction between the idea of being pro-business and being pro-market. And sometimes maybe people on the right get a little bit more focused on pro-business versus pro-market. Pro-business meaning basically supportive incumbents, right, as opposed to open market competition. And so, you kind of get in these arguments about how things should work, but the big thing regardless of where you sit on that, the big thing is okay, how are we going to score the results, right? If you're on the left and you want the government to do more, then how do we score the results of all the government work? If you're on the right and you think the free market should be doing more of this, how do we score those results? right? And it shouldn't just be more of the same. It shouldn't be these programs that run for a very long time and chew lots of money. I mean, the stories, you know, I'll pick on California again because I live in California. I pay for all this.
It's easy to do.
It's endlessly both frustrating and entertaining to pick on California. But, you know, we have a high-speed rail project, right, under development in California. It's been under development for like a decade, you know, here's a radical idea. Let's connect Northern California and Southern California, right? Like, this is like a radical, like, breakthrough thinking idea, like infrastructure. Let's have like a high-speed train that connects.
A bunch of records stopped in California right now, and they scratched when you said that.
Yeah, exactly. So well, the good news is the politicians agree that this is the goal. I think it's like they're $10 billion or something into the project, and they still haven't laid the first piece of track, right? And it's just like, okay, what on earth? Like, it's like, how does that much money flush, right out of a system? And like, where is the high-speed rail, right? And this is where, and I should say, like, a lot of people at this point in the discussion kind of start to say, well, China knows how to do everything, we know how to do nothing, and I don't quite agree with that. But however, in this case, if this were China, like, that train would be running today. It's clear, like, we have the technology to build trains. Yeah. Like, quantum computing, we're still working on. Like, trains we know how to build. And so that should be the scorecard. Is like, is the train actually running? And it is still astonishing to me how often with these programs you'll have these incredibly long conversations about process, and almost nobody will ever actually ask
I mean, is the solution, more market intervention, for the lack of better words? I mean, really what you've seen in the last 20, 25 years is the emergence of the venture industry in the powerhouse that it is now in terms of providing, I think, some of these solutions. Do you think that's all the solution, or do you think it's some of the solution? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so look, and again, people have lots of opinions on this. So we're in the venture capital business, the startup business, and so our view is like there is a general solution to a lot of this, not necessarily a solution to the train, but like to a lot of things, which is like, okay, if a certain kind of product isn't getting made, let's just start a company and fund a company that is going to make that thing. There's a huge opportunity for that across a lot of markets, including the really big and thorny markets like healthcare and education, and the reason is just because a big part of what's happened basically in this country is we actually don't have a free market system per se. We have this sort of oligopolistic government entangled called a mixed economy, right? And so basically if you look across like lots of industries in the US, basically what you see is this pattern where it basically people will tell you it's a free market system, but it's actually not. Let's take banking as an example, right? So you've got the three really big banks that became famous in the financial crisis and the great book Too Big to Fail, and they made a movie about it. And so everybody identified there's these three big banks: JP Morgan, Citibank, Bank of America, and they're too big to fail, and they have to get bailed out, as it turns out, repeatedly. And then basically every time they're bailed out, and this happened in 2008, there's a big backlash to the bailout, right? And then everybody says, well, we can never let this happen again. And so therefore, too big to fail banks cannot be allowed to exist anymore. We need a larger number of smaller banks. We need to disassemble these conglomerates, and we need to get to a larger number of smaller banks so we have redundancy and resiliency in the system. Sitting here today, 12 years later, right, all those three banks are much larger than they were in 2008. They're much bigger, and they've actually rolled up a lot of market share in the banking sector. And then, by the way, new bank charters in the US have dropped to essentially zero. There's like a couple of Amish banks, and like I'm in favor of Amish banks. They're just not likely to go for market share. And there's a couple of other banks, but like new bank charters actually were running pretty high up until 2008, and then they dropped to zero. And so whatever happened in banking reform and regulation and all these bills and everything, these 1,000-page bills that pass, it's not clear if anybody ever reads them, right, is somehow the result of all that has been these too big to fail banks are much larger, and then they've gotten intertwined with the Treasury Department in this very interesting way. And part of it is like so-called regulatory capture, which is when you have these monopolies and oligopolies, they attach themselves to their regulators, yeah, right? And then you have this sort of revolving door, right, kind of process where kind of people know they have jobs in the future. But there's another side to it, which is if you talk to those bank CEOs, which I do, they'll tell you that the Treasury Department now just like runs the banks. They just like give them orders on how to operate as if they're units of the federal government, and they just tell them what they can and can't do. So what you've got is structurally what you've got is an oligopoly attached to a regulatory agency, yeah, in a sort of an octopus, right? And so like in some sort of death grip, right? And so the good news when that, and by the way, that is our education system, right? That is our healthcare system. That is, that is our transportation system. That's our airline industry. Like
is the solution tons of smaller companies that are competing at a level playing field?
So the opportunity that just jumps off the page for us, the opportunity is like, okay, the consequence of an oligopoly attached to the government like that is they're going to stop innovating. Like they're just not going to do new things, and they're not going to do new things in part because their regulators don't want them to, and then also just because the culture that gets built inside those companies or evolves inside those companies becomes based on compliance, basic conformity, and politics. And so the sort of energy, life spirit of innovation and creativity kind of drains out of those companies. And so on the one hand, you're like, wow, that's a great opportunity because like there's all these technology changes. There should be all these new online banks, all these new online banking services. There's this whole so-called fintech wave to start all these new online financial services. And there are lots of startups kind of going after this, and we fund a lot of those. So the good news is there's a big opportunity that opens up to go do all the innovation that oligopoly can no longer do. The problem is that oligopoly with its associated regulatory apparatus is very strong and good at shutting down new competition, right? Which is why the new bank charters have dropped to zero. Like the first thing they did was they just literally said there will be no new banks in the U.S., right? As like a very basic thing. And so they have a lot of power to be able to squash this new competition. So I've sometimes used the metaphor that what we do in Silicon Valley is a little bit like the climax of Star Wars, which is like we're running X-Wing fighters up against the Death Star, right? Right, and the X-Wing fighters are the startups, right? And then the Death Star is this mega monolith thing, which is this sort of conjoined government oligopoly kind of thing. And we know there's an exhaust pipe, right? We know there's a vulnerability, like because they're not innovating. So we know that there's a way to kind of go in and fire a torpedo, down their smokestack. But like, boy, the Death Star actually has pretty good defenses. Yeah. And an awful lot of TIE fighters, and a lot of the X-Wing fighters don't make it through.
So I mean, in the room, you have tons of policy folks, you have tons of press, and I think pretty consistently everybody in the room, wants us to win. It wants our families to do well and wants us to promote this democratic system. Can policymakers, is the best contribution to say, hey, let's support these young companies, or what's the action item? If in the board meeting sense of the word, what's the action item for folks who are maybe believe this or agree with some of the premise in terms of changing the direction?
Yeah, so again here, the prescription depends on where you fall in the political spectrum, and I want to respect that because people have different points of view. For sure, I would come back to the distinction I made between pro-business and pro-market. There's a temptation to speak, you see this all the time, there's a temptation to speak in terms of like the American business sector or like the American economy or the American whatever industry in a certain category. And it's just basically like, okay, just talk about industry structures. There's monopoly, and we kind of all know monopoly is bad. Then there's oligopoly, and that, one is it's like the word's harder to spell. It's harder to pronounce. It's more complicated. Sounds like oligarchy, makes people nervous. But there's oligopoly, which is really what we tend to have. We don't tend to have monopolies, we tend to have oligopolies. And oligopoly is, two or three or four kind of dominant companies that kind of lock up a market. Like the car industry in the US was an oligopoly for 60 years, right? Under GM, Ford, and Chrysler until, we finally got, a successful new entrant with Tesla. So that's like the classic thing, and then and so what happens is sort of pro-business becomes pro-oligopoly, and it sort of becomes the support of kind of these incumbents. Well, it's actually kind of funny because it's like there's a lot like in the press or in politics right now. There's a lot of people who are like really mad at for some reason. I won't cop to anything, but for some reason people are really mad at tech startups. They're really mad at venture capital. They're really mad at disruption. They're really mad at innovation. And actually, it's funny. They're really mad at tech startups and at venture capital. What they're doing when they get mad at us and try to restrict what we can do is they're actually defending the entrenched corporate power of these oligopolies, which is weird because these are not big company CEOs usually don't get a lot of people defending them, right? But that's somehow kind of where all this stuff ends up. And so the alternative to an oligopoly and a pro-business policy in support of the oligopoly in whatever industry you're talking about is an actual free market, right? With actual free market competition, where the customers actually have a choice and where the providers of the product or service actually have to compete to be able to get the business. And so, being a free market person, I would say like you're almost always going to get better results when you open this up. Can I tell you my favorite example of this?
Yeah.
Favorite example, healthcare. So healthcare is like the monster, it's like the oligopoly cubed or something. It's, healthcare is now 20% of the American economy, right? On its way to 50%. Right, and everybody's just like tremendously furious about this. Everybody just hates this. And then if you look at the price curves on healthcare, like why is it becoming so much of the economy? Well, the price curves, the price of everything keeps rising. And there's, been endless studies of, why does insulin cost $800, not $8, and why are we having, kind of all these issues around, why does heart surgery cost so much, and so forth. Well, it's actually interesting. There are a category of surgical procedures that actually are on the complete opposite price curve. They're on the sort of tech price curve where the price of the procedure is falling every year and the quality of the procedure is getting much, much better as the price falls. And the classic example of this other category procedure is laser eye surgery. And if you look at the price curve in laser eye surgery, it looks like the price curve on like computer chips or on like television sets or something. It's just like, it gets cheaper all the time. And then I mean, this is advanced, these laser eye surgery on your eye, they do like real-time 3D mapping of your eyeball. So if you flinch during the procedure, which I did, it's still like the laser tracks. Like, it's really sophisticated stuff, and yet the price of that procedure is falling. Why is it falling? The reason it's falling is because it's an elective procedure. It's not covered by insurance, right? It's something that consumers choose to buy. And because consumers choose to buy it, right, it's a direct interaction between a willing provider and a willing customer, and then there's actual competition, right? And so, and again, this is a giant complicated topic, and it's not like you can just wave your hand and make everything like that. But like, if you can make laser eye surgery super cheap and super good, there is going to be a way to do that in the rest of healthcare.
Putting buyers and sellers closer together.
Well, that's one of the answers. There's a lot of things that screw up. There's a lot of things that make the healthcare market dysfunctional. The fact that there's indirect payers, right, is a big part of it. The fact that the products or services are very complicated is another thing. The fact that people hate the topic because when you're in the hospital about to get heart surgery, you're maybe not at your best when it comes to trying to figure out.
You're not looking for a discount.
The technical details, right? Or maybe in a position to do price comparison shopping at that moment. Maybe not the best idea. And so it's a complicated thing, but put it this way, if we don't like the track we're on, right, we should look at these cases in which we're actually seeing the behavior that we want, and we should figure out how to get inside those industries and make things more like that. And we could choose to do that. Generally speaking, we're not choosing to do that. We're choosing to go the other way. We're choosing to entrench the existing systems and the existing dynamics that are kind of driving the outcomes we don't like. And so I would say I'm not optimistic on this point, but we're going to, we try. We're trying. My firm has a big healthcare push. We're going to try to do this in more aspects of healthcare.
Fantastic. Today, we're focusing specifically on autonomy and defense. What do you believe that other folks would debate quite vigorously with you about?
Okay, so here's where I can set hair on fire. I'm excited. This is good. This is one I've been looking forward to. So
people like to debate here. So
yeah. So the thing about autonomy that gets everybody right in the national security world kind of the most nervous, right, is sort of the decision making. Who's making the decision, particularly who's making the decision to fire the weapon. And so, there's been this, big kind of assumption from, the very beginning of these drone programs and so forth that, it always has to be human in the loop. It often, by the way, has to not just be a human in the loop. It has to be like a very specific, like, Air Force officer, for example, to be able to make these decisions. And I think that was obviously the right starting point, and there's a lot in favor of that. And by the way, I think there's a legitimate argument that basically the decision to kill somebody is so important that maybe it should always be human in the loop. Like, maybe from an ethical standpoint, maybe that's just simply required. So let me say, like, I have respect for that point of view. Having said that, here's what I really believe. What I really believe is humans are terrible decision makers. Like, we are freaking awful at making decisions. And this comes up all the time. I'll take a parallel market. This comes up all the time in self-driving cars, right? The whole dispute around civilian self-driving cars, right? Which is, it's like, okay, should the car? And it's actually really funny. People pose these like ethical conundrums, right, when they're talking about self-driving cars, and they call these the trolley problems. And it's like, okay, the self-driving car, it's in a situation in which like it's either going to hit a car filled with like 5 grandmas or like 1 6-year-old, right? And like is the car going to make like the morally correct decision of who to kill? And it's like, okay, that's great, but like I just was driving in from, and I'm looking at the drivers in the cars, next to us driving in, and I'm like, one guy's on his phone texting, somebody else is drinking a milkshake, somebody else is putting makeup on in the mirror, somebody else is kind of dozing off, getting a little bit drowsy. Like, people are terrible drivers.
Yeah.
And people are terrible drivers, and people are actually getting worse at driving because they've got more distractions, right?
And the statistics show it. I mean, how many people die every year?
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually funny watching the car companies, the older car companies, kind of pre-Tesla. The older car companies aren't so good at autonomy, but they've gotten really good at the entertainment systems that go inside the cab. And so they've got, you buy a car and it's got like all these amazing videos, and it's got internet radio, and it's got like all these different, well, and to give credit to Tesla actually has video games on the center screen, which is a little bit disconcerting. And so there's like all these things that you can do, but then it's like there's these things where like if the car's in motion, it locks out certain functions, right? So like the navigation system won't let you punch in an address or whatever. And so I don't know about you, but like, I have now explored that system at great length sitting in traffic trying to figure out what it will let me do when I'm supposed to be paying attention, right? And so we're distracted. We get tired, we get drunk, we get high, we get distracted. We get important text messages. so what if I'm going 70 miles an hour? Like, I have to answer this text message. And so it's just quite clear that the car, right, and what does the car have the human doesn't? Well, one is it doesn't have any of that, right, but also it has comprehensive knowledge of what's going on around it. Like, it sees a lot more, right, because among other things, the computer sees 360 degrees all the time, whereas no human being does. And then the car is processing all this data, at an incredibly fast and ferocious rate, and then it's just able to be kind of very crisp and methodical about how it makes these decisions. And so I think that's the underlying truth for autonomous weapons, which is we are probably forever going to have serious ethical concerns with turning over the decisions to the algorithms. On the other hand, it will prove, I think, in the fullness of time that the machines make much better decisions. And in the fullness of time, we will look back on having there will come a time, I don't know how fast it happens, there will come a time we will look back at the idea that we put a gun in a human being's hand and then put them in a situation where their adrenaline spiked off the charts.
He was very young and maybe not fully trained.
And scared out of his mind, yeah. Right? And put it and literally just adrenaline, like just the impact of adrenaline in the decision making, right? It can just like really screw you up, right? And so that we put somebody in that situation and expected them to make that decision, right? Or the same thing in a cockpit or the same thing in a submarine. We'll look back and say, were we out of our minds? How did we ever let, basically our, animal evolved brains ever make that decision? It will take us a long time to get there, but, in the long run, I think there's no question. The logic tells you that's what will happen.
Yeah.
Now, whether we'll get all the way there and whether that's the ethical thing, I think that's the big debate.
Changing gears a little bit about just kind of Silicon Valley and the government and the defense universe. One of the things that I feel like I've noticed living in Silicon Valley is we live in a pretty violent world globally. But if you live in Mountain View, you live in a pretty great life, and you're kind of under this blanket of security. And one of the downstream impacts is people don't realize that. And you start living in this bubble. And so sometimes when discussions about Silicon Valley and defense come up, they're weirdly emotional. So how do you, number one, not live in that bubble? If you're born in a healthy family and that has means, to realize that the world is beyond you, and maybe even a bigger question, it's happening kind of in society where you have these bubbles of ideas. So how do you get out of your own bubble to experience, perhaps someone else's viewpoints to make more informed decisions?
Yeah, and so maybe everybody knows what Qasar's referring to is, in particular, is like there was this basically movement in the Valley, probably starting 15 years. So it's interesting, actually. The Valley a lot of the origins of the Valley actually are in work with the military, right? Yeah. So a classic example is Oracle, the company Oracle, is named after the CIA project, codename Oracle, in the 1970s that Larry Ellison worked on as a consultant and then turned it ultimately into a product and a company. And so, the deep origins of Silicon Valley have a lot to do with military and intelligence work, actually going back to like the 1920s. And so there's a long tradition. And then actually, I'm now old enough where I've seen multiple eras. And actually, in the 90s, that spirit was actually still somewhat alive. And in fact, my company, Netscape, in the 90s actually had a lot of actual work with the federal government and with defense and intelligence agencies. We did, among other things, we did the first public key encryption infrastructure for DoD in the 90s. So we were pretty tight in. So we kind of always took it for granted. Starting about 20 years ago, there was like a culture, it's kind of post the .com crash, there was this culture shift that sort of developed where, there was like this growing level of abstraction, and there were more and more people and companies and founders and investors who basically said, we don't want our companies involved in anything even remotely close to defense or intelligence. And it was this weird thing, which is it was sort of like a cultural, social, almost like, I don't know, a Vietnam War hangover maybe a little bit, but then also like when the Iraq War didn't go well and there weren't WMD, I think that also made it easier to kind of say, the military is a bad idea. And then the Snowden stuff like made it worse again, and this like, I don't know whether we should work with intelligence agencies.
And I think you have this situation where commercial starts leading. Like the most advanced tech ends up now being in the commercial space, whereas you could look up, and if you're in the 60s, 70s, you're kind of wowed by what the DoD is doing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's actually a big inversion. It actually the way technology used to flow actually was it started in the government, particularly in defense and intelligence, and then it worked its way into companies after that. And then after that, it went to consumers, right? And then, about 20, 25 years ago, that flipped, and then new technology started to hit consumers first, then companies, and then government, which is, a big problem out here. And so that really happened. And then, of course, another weird thing happened, right, which has been well covered, but which is important, which was a lot of the same companies who didn't want to work with the U.S. government ended up working with the Chinese government, right? And either like explicitly cutting deals with the Chinese government to be able to operate in China, or indirectly working with the Chinese government by having, let's just say, research partnerships was the term that was often used. So you have an AI lab in Beijing, and it is associated with a company that is 30% staffed by CCP members, and all companies in China are owned and controlled by the party, and the party has total authority. And by the way, the military, cooperation with the military is mandatory, right? And before you know it, you're in business with the Chinese military, and you're not in business with the American military. And so that developed. It's very much a bubble phenomenon. I think it's very much a bubble phenomenon. It's very much, by bubble I mean it's very much it's the kind of attitude that you can have if you think that you are completely safe in the world and that there's never going to be any more threats, which is certainly not what I believe. Now, this Russia-Ukraine thing is interesting because the same people who were the most opposed to working with the U.S. military before Russia-Ukraine are now, they all have Ukraine flag emojis on their Twitter profiles. And so
buy Ukraine flags. They're going up into the right.
There are so many people in California who will hang Ukraine flags outside their house and not American flags. It's the craziest thing. They hate Putin so much. And so there's a little bit of a swing here. But by and large, what's happened is you ended up in this sort of culture that got too kind of sideways on this. But then that opened up an opportunity, right? And then that's the opportunity that you guys are in. That's the opportunity that we're going after with our programs. It's the opportunity that Andrew is another famous example, kind of going after this, which is like, okay, like if Google's not going to do this kind of thing, then let's start new companies that are going to do it, right? It's the opportunity that opens up. It's the exhaust port in the Death Star that opens up. And so there are now opportunities emerging that are coming out the other side. There are people like us and like me that think about this very differently. And then the other thing that's just really happened, I think, is that the divergence between what technology has now made possible for defense and intelligence and what they're getting from their traditional suppliers has just never been. I don't think it's ever been wider. Yeah. Like there are so many things now that are possible with all these new technologies, and you see a lot of it, a lot of the discussion here. And they're just not going to get provided by the established vendors. Like it's just that ship has sailed. Those companies don't do things like this anymore. And so the actual substantive opportunity, need, requirement, challenge, right, is really opening up. And actually, the government is sort of famously a difficult customer in this era, but the government is starting to unlock serious buying power here and starting to really vote with their dollars. And so that's causing, I think, more entrepreneurs to get pretty excited.
So let's shift gears once again. Talk a little bit about the markets and kind of a little away from the DC ecosystem. Buffett has this very famous line that when people are greedy, be fearful, and when people are fearful, be greedy. And there's a lot of fear in the markets right now. There's a lot of volatility in the markets right now. Number one, what's your view on the public markets? I know you guys are a venture capital fund, but would love to hear that. And then what's the downstream impact to this very important part of our economy, which is creating wealth and creating new companies, which is like seed stage startups of 2 to 3 people in a handful of geographies in the U.S.?
Yeah, so this has been a weird 3 years. I don't know if people have noticed. This has been an unusual time. But I would kind of put in that context, which is rewind back to December of 2019, which was not that long ago. December 2019, the U.S. economy was the best economy in America in 70 years. On basically any metric that you could pick. And like one of the metrics that you look at for the health of the economy is actually interesting. It's employment rate among teenage males without a high school diploma. And that's tradition. This is sort of the hardest part of the workforce ultimately. When you kind of get all the way through it, like that's the group that always has the highest unemployment. And it's the hardest group to get to. And that metric was the best in 70 years in December 2019. So like the economy was going like really well. And in fact, actually it's interesting, right? We had very low inflation, very low interest rates. And actually we had, there was a complaint for a long time we didn't have wage growth, but wage growth was starting to, to tick up and things were going really well. And then obviously COVID happened. And then of course, you may recall COVID, there was this weird thing, which is we all immediately knew that COVID was the end of the world. In addition to being a huge public health problem, it was also the end of the world economically. The stock market crashed. It resulted literally in, people screaming and crying on CNBC, which by the way is always a really good indicator. At least that something is going on when there's yelling and
Cry
tears.
per hour ratio.
The cries per hour is a good You have to correct for the increased rate of crying in the entire society, but when you distill that down, you measure that as an indicator. So people get the stock market collapsed. It looked like the end of the economic world, and then this just incredibly bizarre thing happened, which is the stock market did a V shape, right, and it just went to the moon, right, and there was just this like incredible rush of enthusiasm for owning stocks, like straight into the face of a pandemic, which I was just like I was just like stunned and amazed. It was just like, and it was actually really funny. It was actually not funny. It was not, as they say, it wasn't funny, haha. It was funny kind of as if I was going to start crying. We thought coming into COVID, we thought we might lose an entire generation of startups, right? Because we thought business might just freeze across the board and it might be impossible for companies to raise money. And then all of a sudden, it's just like stock prices take off, and all of a sudden, Silicon Valley just goes into this like hyper boom. It just got incredibly easy to raise money, and people were so thrilled to be able to like invest money in things. There was a whole retail frenzy. VC. A funny thing happened in venture land in our world, investor land, which is, in a given venture capitalist or public investor, whatever, they normally work like an 8-hour day and whatever. They do meetings with management teams, and they come through, and then everybody goes on Zoom, and it's like, well, I can't go out, I can't visit my family, right? I can't like visit my sick relatives in the hospital. Yeah, I might as well just take more meetings over video. And so people started like taking 12 hours a day of video meetings. And then, of course, there's no travel time, so that's the equivalent of like 16 hours of real-life meetings. And so all of a sudden, there was just this like huge surge of business activity, and everybody got.
And did you see that in seeds, Series A, all the way up?
We saw it at every stage. And then, by the way, the other thing we saw was like a lot of tech-related things took off. Like so, e-commerce like took off like a banshee. Like e-commerce accelerated dramatically. Online streaming, online gaming, online education. Just like a huge online grocery delivery. Food delivery. Like a lot of internet-based services. Just like the actual businesses took off, which of course compounded, got everybody super excited. And so the weirdest thing, it's like maybe the weirdest thing I've ever seen, which is like the pandemic was fantastic, which is just like not supposed to happen. And so of course, now that I've seen something that weird, now I'm seeing the equivalently weird thing, which is now that we're coming out of the pandemic, it's horrible, right? And everybody's in a terrible mood. And so, I would say it's a weird reaction. It's not the reaction I would have expected coming out of the pandemic with things returning to normal. I think there's two possibilities for what's happening right now. One possibility is that basically all of the headlines are right. And basically what the headlines tell you is it's the end of the world, it's inflation, it's hyperinflation, like we're back to the 1970s. We've kicked off a process of inflation. All the money printing that the government's been doing for the last 20 years is going to finally bite us. Interest rates are going to the moon.
Going to the moon as in 18.5% that we had in the late 70s, or going to the moon like much more rationally?
So I just reread because I remember inflation as a little kid, but like it's been 40 years of falling inflation and falling interest rates, and so I just went back and I read. There's two books on Paul Volcker, one that he wrote and a biography that kind of go through the sort of the whole thing because he's the guy who cracked inflation and interest rates 40 years ago when it was a big crisis, and it was really interesting. The big thing in the books was like, and this is the big danger, and this scenario may be playing out. The big danger is once an inflationary spiral starts, like it's hard to stop because inflation changes psychology. Right, and if people think that money is becoming less valuable, they start to behave in really different ways as compared to when they think that money's flat. And then the fact that they behave in those ways causes inflation to rise even faster. And so there's this, and when it goes really bad, you get Germany in the 1920s or something with hyperinflation, right, which is really bad. And this is why the central banks are always focused on containing inflation because like things can really run away when that happens. And then interest rates have to chase inflation all the way up because money's getting less valuable, and then all of a sudden it's 15-20% mortgage rates, nobody can buy a house, and then you get the 1970s all over again. So it's possible that that's what's happening, and it's possible that there's going to be a big recession and a big crash in consumer demand, and all these tech companies that were selling all these goods and services, all of a sudden nobody wants to buy their stuff, and so e-commerce is way down, and Netflix is in trouble, and like all these things have reversed. Zoom stock has crashed. Peloton's down to 3 months, so down to 3/4 of cash. Even, and they were like, the superstar of the. We're not involved in Peloton. They were the superstar of the pandemic, and now they're, they were worth like $50 billion, and now they, so say they have to raise money. And so, like, it's possible that this is going to be a really bad, kind of event. It's also possible this is kind of the mirror image of what happened entering the pandemic, and there the possibility is just this is a temporary phenomenon. This is a temporary phenomenon caused by mismatches of supply and demand in the economy, and in particular the stuff that's happening in China right now, right? So if China has shut down production of lots of parts, right, for things because of their own COVID policies, then a lot of American manufacturers can't make things because everybody relies on parts from overseas. And then all of a sudden, it sort of looks like the economy is like artificially depressed. It looks like you have too much, right? One of the ways to describe inflation is too much demand chasing too few goods, right? And you see this with cars, right? If you go try to buy a car off the lot, like they'll charge you a premium for it today, which is not like a normal thing that happens in the car industry. It's because they just can't make enough cars. And so it's possible there's this short-term issue of kind of getting supply and demand back into alignment in the economy, and then basically once that's happened, we will rediscover that we actually still have the best economy in 70 years. We just went through this weird kind of COVID moment. That said, I have no idea which way this goes.
If there's a continuing pullback, how do you what's the partner meeting inside of A16Z, and what's the the guidance to companies like us?
Yeah, so the sort of mainstream activity in the Valley, like the main thing that happens that sort of determines whether, well, there's two things that determine whether a startup happens or not. One is whether there's a founder that is qualified and wants to actually build a company. And then the other is sort of it's really the Series A round, right? There's this early seed financing, but it's really like the Series A round is like where basically a company is like anointed and basically is like greenlit for lots of people to come to work for it and for for be able to raise more money down the road. And then basically the math is when you make a Series A investment as a venture firm, you basically assume it's going to be a 7 to 10 year period before that company eventually either goes public or gets bought, right? So you kind of got this, you sort of light a 7 to 10 year fuse for the companies that work. And so one argument should be whatever's happening in the public market today shouldn't matter at all for startups and for Series A rounds, because who knows what the market's going to be doing in 7 to 10 years. Whatever's happening now will be long gone. There'll be some other set of crazy things that are happening. And when we can't forecast what's going to happen 7 to 10 years from now, and so we should just ignore what's happening today. It has no bearing on anything. That's a good argument. The other argument is, well, the thing is, the Series A companies, they're going to need to raise more money. And they're going to need to go back out in 18, 24 months to raise a Series B. Are those investors going to be willing to invest? Well, the problem those investors have when they do a Series B is that company's going to need to go raise money, a Series C, in 18 to 24 months. Well, those investors will willing to invest, and then you kind of spin that forward all the way to the public markets. And then and that's why the public markets basically have this big impact earlier on. Because you basically get worried, yes, I can fund the company today, but it will die because of this kind of chain of events that are unfolding. It won't be able to raise more money, and it won't be able to succeed. And so that's how these changes in these public markets kind of ricochet all the way back to the early stage. That's definitely happening right now. Whether that continues to happen is a question of what happens in the public market.
You're seeing prices fall in the A market and seed, or no?
So right now, my favorite cartoon when I was a kid was the Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, right? And the Roadrunner's chasing the coyote, and the coyote goes off the edge of the cliff, right? And he hangs there in midair, right? And he holds up the sign and he says, "Oops." Yeah. Right, and then he falls, right? But there's that moment where he's like hanging in midair, and we're kind of in that moment a little bit where basically, because it's like, look, if this is what happened in the spring of 2020, and the market is just in this weird downward thing right now, but it's going to come roaring back as sort of normality resumes, then this would be a terrible time to stop investing. On the other hand, if this is a sustained economic downturn and a sustained stock market crash, then it would be a bad idea to get too enthusiastic about investing. Because, by the way, if it's a sustained downturn, we need to husband cash to be able to support the existing companies and help keep them in business. And so actually what's happening right now is rounds are either getting done at the old prices or they're not getting done at all.
Yeah, very bimodal.
Right, bimodal. And so that's Wile E. Coyote kind of hanging in the air. And then basically the next 6 or 9 months will sort of determine which way this goes. And, look, I like to get up here and give speeches on how great venture capital is and all that. I will tell you, like, we are a small little gnat on the fringe. I mean, we're tiny. Like,
there's probably some sub-debt market which is bigger than
Yeah, we're tiny. Yeah, exactly. That right. You're, whatever. Yeah, the third slice of whatever mortgage tranching on your house is bigger than we are. Like, we are a tiny little adjunct to the financial markets. We are part of this much broader, kind of phenomenon. I mean, venture capital. The S&P 500 biggest companies in the U.S. Return in the form of buybacks and dividends more than $1 trillion a year to their shareholders. All of venture capital is like $50 billion a year, right? And so all of a sudden, $50 billion is like a big number, absolutely, but like it's a 20th of just the money coming out of the incumbents who aren't innovating, because that's how they give all the cash back. They don't do new things. And so we're just, unfortunately, we're small, and this is where we're the tail, not the dog. Maybe to use the metaphor, like we're not actually in charge of this, and so we do have to let a little time pass here to kind of see how things change.
So last question. We covered a lot today, from the markets to defense. But all the topics are really around America, right? And so if America is a security, it's a stock. Series A comes to your desk. Are you buy, sell, hold, and why not?
Yeah. So in my bad moods, what I say is we're the best house in a bad neighborhood, which is if you don't like our problems, don't go anywhere else.
Yeah.
Because everywhere else is worse. And I probably should not give my big speech about how everybody else is worse, because that'll piss everybody off. But everybody else has problems. And by the way, China, I mean, God knows China. Actually, this is actually interesting. China has problems. A couple years ago, it was actually hard to find like American business people who would admit that China has problems. All of a sudden, they're all the China boosters in the U.S. are very, very quiet. They're not saying much. They're not volunteering a lot at the dinner parties because China's got this like just incredible lockdown happening right now, like way beyond anything that we did. And so like we have our issues, but like we have like just a tremendous portfolio of strengths, kind of even against that. And so and this is always the question. Like the question is, would you trade places, right?
Yeah.
If you were in charge of the U.S., would you trade places with China or with Sweden or with Singapore or with take your pick of India or any country, Germany, whatever? And I just think the answer to that's pretty clearly no. Every election cycle there are some set of celebrities that declare loudly that they're going to leave the U.S. right? And I guess
Still waiting.
some of them go to I don't know, maybe Canada or something, but like they don't tend to venture out very far. So best house in a bad neighborhood. In my optimistic moments, which is most of the time. I mean, it's just that there's no Reagan line I always liked, which is there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. And so there's just so much latent capability. The people, our people are so smart and so strong. I mean, look, we're the result of 250 years of positive selection of immigration, right? We're like the most aggressive, smartest, most capable, most determined immigrants, right? Got from where they came here, right? And so we are a ferocious. We don't think of ourselves this way, but like we are a ferocious a beast when it comes to being like a very competent people. And very tough and very strong and very resilient. It sometimes takes us a while. It's the old Churchill thing. America always does the right thing after it's exhausted all the alternatives, right? So like, it takes us a while to rise to the occasion, but like we do tend to come roaring back, and it's just that the inherent strengths are so powerful. And then there's all the other kind of more tangible things, which is like we have, our territory is like very easy to defend. It's very hard to invade, very much unlike a lot of others. Our natural resources are off the charts. We have here's a build thing. We have the ability to be fully energy independent anytime we want to, right? China doesn't have that, right? They actually can't do that. We can do that. They don't have the resources. We do have the resources. Now, we are choosing not to, but we could. And so we have all the raw materials, both literally and figuratively, that we need to be, by far not just the best country in the world, but the best country the planet's ever seen. And so from there, it just gets to a matter of choice, which is do we want to be?
That sounds like a strong buy.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Fascinating conversation.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.